Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of our Azure Administrator study series. Hope you all had a wonderful day, and we are very glad that you've joined us for today's session. We got our honorable Sir David here to deliver
this word
another incredible session for us. So,
this word honorable without the stomach or the neck of an honorable. I'm not sure.
uh, that's how it begins, right? David, very slow. But you are taking care of your body, so I believe you will not get to that state.
with the gym session that we had this morning, Sakofi, I think there'll be a long time before we get to the honorable status and stuff. How's your day been? Has it been good day? Busy day?
It has been a busy day for me,
Mhm.
but yeah, I can't complain. How about you? How's your day?
Yeah, it's been really busy also. So just lots of deadline. Just trying to sort out a few issues, and then right after this call and this session, there's another stuff to go sort out before tomorrow. So
Wow,
that's sort of like the way
well,
that it goes
you
these
keep
days.
going, right?
Yeah, yeah, nice.
So, what do you have for us for today?
So today what we're gonna do is we're gonna continue from where we stopped yesterday. So yesterday we looked at platform compute in Azure, which is part of the AZ104 objectives, which is the Azure App Service. So today we're going to carry on with that conversation, and um, we're going to start looking at containers in Azure, right? And let me share my screen very quickly, so we'll see what the exam objectives are for
Okay.
the AZ104 when it comes to containers. So let's see that very, very quickly. Let's go over here and let's go. Have you been enjoying the sun today? The sun has been really bright today. Did you open your windows out too?
Yeah, I have, man. It's just incredible at the moment. It's just too hot. Yeah. How
Yeah,
about you? Is
exactly.
it hot there as well?
No, but here's the thing: is that I have been feeling cold because I opened the window, I opened the door, I opened all the doors so that the fresh
Yeah,
air can
fresh
flow,
flow.
can flow very, very easily and stuff. My wife was like, "Get air conditioner." Uh,
I noticed that your neighbors have an air conditioner, right?
yeah, yeah. It's sort of like I mean, it makes sense for them to get it, but I don't make Sarkophis money yet, so I don't make that money yet. So once I make that money, then we're gonna be doing that.
Get it.
I'm not sure how the weather is in Ghana, but I'm sure it's probably similar to the weather in Nigeria. We grew up in like very hot conditions without AC, so
But I mean, back in Ghana, there almost like every workplace, like office, or they got AC. You cannot do without an AC.
Oh, I see. What about at home though? Do people
At
have
home, yeah, obviously, if you have the money, it's all about the money, right?
Oh, okay, I see. But
It's
would you
all
say
about
that
the break.
majority of people have like air conditions, or majority
No,
of
no
people don't?
majority, no, no.
Not majority. Similar
It's
like
just
in Nigeria
the
also.
rich
So
people.
yeah,
Yeah,
similar. So what we do, we have like sort of like this fan
yeah, the
and
ceiling
the
fan.
fan. Yeah, the ceiling fan and stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, yeah, it's stuff like that. Well, Star Coffee is a different level that you're in now. Okay. Anyways, so when it comes to containers and the objectives of the AZ104, yeah, the objectives that we have for you, or that Microsoft has described. So we're going to look at configuring sizing, scaling for Azure Container Instances. We're going to look at what Azure Container Instances are. Then we're going to look at configuring container groups for Azure Container Instances. And we're going to look at configuring storage for Kubernetes service. I'm not sure we'll be able to get to that today, but we'll see where we get to. We're going to look at configuring scaling. We're going to look at configuring network connections for Azure Kubernetes service. We're going to look at upgrading an AKS cluster. So here are the objectives of the AZ104 certification, which is what we're looking at. So we're going to try to cover as much of those as we can, and hopefully you'll be able to cover the rest sort of like on by yourself. So
Okay.
what we're going to start with today. So Sarkofi, like, can you help us to understand? So when we say containers, like, what are we talking about, right? Is it containers for gold, right? Is it container of of what? What are we talking about?
Well, so for my understanding of the container is, I mean, let's look at it this way. I mean, we have virtual machines, right?
Yes.
And they help you to deploy, let's say, your website and other services.
Yep.
Then then came what we call what container, which seems to be much lighter and easy to run compared to a virtual machine. And when something is containerized, that means it contains all the elements of that specific application that will allow you to run. So, for example, in the past, um, let's say a developer developed an application, right?
Mm.
And then he gave it to someone to test it, or maybe
Yep.
give it to a customer. One
Mm.
of the things that they seem to encounter a lot is that the behavior of that application might not be the same for, let's say, customer A to maybe
Mm.
another customer.
Yep.
Then now, so but the developer will say, okay, but when I created this, it runs on my environment with no issue.
Yeah.
So to address this issue, what we do with container is that we can now essentially containerize or ensure that we pick every element or whatever machine the developer created the application on, and
Mm.
then we put it into a container, and then we give that to, let's say, the test guy and also to everyone. So essentially, the same environment, the same conditions
Mm.
is being given to everyone else. So that's
Yeah.
what we classify as what container, and it's more like a very lighter weight as
Mm.
well. So it make application run faster, and also you can also use what we call the microservices. You can use smaller unit of what we call ports, so that
Mm.
you don't have to contain all your services into one specific unit,
Mm.
essentially. So I know I've talked a lot, but yeah.
That's awesome, man. That's
Yeah,
awesome. And to your point, like what you're describing is we have the application. So let me bring up the screen. So we have the application that we're still running. So we still have the application. But what you're describing for us at Kofi is where we have our application and we have the different elements that the application needs to run all
yeah,
bundled together with the application.
that's right.
So maybe that's a application there, that's a published application that the developers have created. That's going to need a runtime environment to run, like what you said, Sakofi. So that's going to include the runtime bundled together. And maybe this application also has dependencies that it's going to need to run. We're going to take all those dependencies of the applications. We're going to bundle everything together into a container image. And then we're going to ship that and distribute that to users of our applications.
Yeah,
So that's what essentially what Sarkozy was explaining there. So let's go have a quick look at this. So the approach that I'm going to take when I talk about containerization, I think it's a very good approach. So the approach that we're going to take is whenever we talk about containerization, Sarkozy, there's always three aspects that we're talking about. Always, right? Three aspects to containerization. We're talking about building the container image. That's the first place to start, right?
yeah,
We have an application. We want to containerize this application. We want to package this application as a container image, as this simple unit and that Sarkozy was describing earlier. So that's the first stage that we talk about when we talk about containerization. The second stage that we talk about containerization is once we have our image, we want to store that image somewhere and we want to distribute it from somewhere, right? So, for example, Sarkozy wants to download, software to mine Bitcoin and all that stuff. Sarkozy goes to the website to get the software to download it. You have a location that you go to download this software from. It's the same when you have your application containerized. You have to have a place where you can download it from, right? So we'll talk about that. And then we have to run our container images at runtime, right? So we have three stages here. We have the build stage, we have the store and distribute stage, and we have the runtime stage. And these are the three main stages that we have to talk about whenever we talk about containerization in order for things to make sense. So what we're going to do, Sarkoff, is we're going to start with the build stage first of all today.
all right,
So in Azure, when we're talking about building container images, there are different options that we have. Obviously, the AZ104 certification that we are looking at doesn't go into a lot of details when it comes to that content, but we're still going to just give a quick overview of that. The easiest way to build a container image or I won't say the easiest, but the most simplified way is to use something called a Docker virtual machine. So, what is a Docker virtual machine? A Docker virtual machine is a virtual machine in Azure that has Docker installed on it. It's as simple as that, right? So
Uh,
that's exactly what we're talking about. You have a virtual machine in Azure, you install Docker on it, and you use that virtual machine to build your container image. Is there any downsides to that you think, Sakofi? Like, what do you think? There's a downside to using this option,
Using the Docker.
Docker VM?
Well, I don't know. I don't know because obviously most of these containers
Hmm.
they seem to originate from these Docker. So I'm not sure. I mean, yeah, you go ahead. You just tell us.
I think I probably misphrased, sorry, misdescribed the question. So essentially, because the issue is I've got to manage the operating system going forward for this virtual machine. And I've
Oh, okay,
also got to manage my Docker application because Docker application, they're going to have, right? So now I've got to keep that up to date. My operating
that's right.
system has to be patched probably every month. Then I've got to keep that patched every month. So essentially, what I want to do is build container image, not patch software, right?
Oh, okay. So
but,
yeah.
but, but
So
now
that
I've
means
got
when you push it to the cloud, Azure might take care of that part for you.
there are other options that makes that simplifies that, right?
Right.
Yeah, but for the case of our course today, we're going to be using this option to build a container image. So there are other options that we can use to
Okay.
build container images. Another option is using something called Azure Pipelines. So Azure Pipelines is a service that's part of a solution that Microsoft has called Azure DevOps. So within Azure Pipelines, we can automate the building of our container image. So the
Right.
use case for this, Sakofi, would be, Sakofi has written an amazing application. The application that you've written, you're pushing it into a source control system. You want to have a system such that once the new version of your code hits your source control, it's going to trigger a new container image to be built off of
Wow.
that, right? So something like Azure Pipelines would be a good way, a good option to be able to do that.
Yeah, that's
So,
incredible.
yeah. But we're not going to be covering that today. So when we get to the Azure DevOps exam objectives, we're going to cover that for sure. The other option that we have is something called Azure Container Registry Task. And we're not even going to get into this one a lot today. So the use case of this one is mainly from a security perspective of patching our container images. Because as you can imagine, Sakofi, we have that container image. It has all these dependencies and all the base components packaged in it. Those base components can also get out of date,
That's
right?
right.
So what that means is if I'm using pipeline to build my container images, I have to run that container image through the pipeline just to update it again, right? And this option simplifies that task of patching our images. So we can say whenever there's a new version of this runtime, just patch it directly in the registry where I'm storing the image. I don't want to be running it through the pipeline again. But those are the three main options that we have when we talk about building container images. So here's what I'm going to do now, Sakofi. I'm going to head over. I've got two systems over here. I'm not going to go through everything from scratch. So let's go ahead and clear the screen. And let me make this a bit bigger so that it's going to be more visible. So let's go to change settings and let's go to appearance. Let's make that more bigger so that it's going to be more easier to see what's going on here. So I'm going to make that 22 and I'm going to go ahead and click OK to that. Sakofi, is that clearer?
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
really good. Yeah.
Awesome. Awesome, man.
Yeah, nice and big.
And yeah, awesome. Yeah, so I'm going to be using this one, but I just want to show people that may not be familiar. How do I, just a virtual machine that I have in Azure, by the way, right? It's just a Linux virtual machine, this other one. So what I want to do is I want to change this. I want to essentially make this into like a Docker virtual machine by installing Docker on it. So I just want to quickly show how that would work. So let's go over here. Let's clear the screen. And you can also get this information, by the way, on the Docker website. So if you just go to the Docker website, find information on how do I install how do I install Docker on an Ubuntu virtual machine? Is going to give you the instruction. But essentially, okay, let me just quickly run this one. Sir Coffee. Let me run that one very, very quickly. So that's just going to do a quick update of the image. Let's clear the screen and let's go ahead and run that. So yeah, that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to go to docker.com and I'm going to go get the script that I'm going to use to install Docker. So that's what that's doing. So I'm going to download the scripts. If I do a list, now I have the scripts downloaded. Now I'm going to run that script and it's going to install Docker for me. So if I do get docker.sh, and then that's going to go through the process. So it's going to run a script, it's going to download Docker, it's going to install it on this virtual machine.
Okay, that's nice and simple.
Yeah. And then once Docker is installed on this virtual machine, I have my Docker virtual machine and I can use it to build my container images. But here's the question, Sir Kofi. Sorry.
We've got a question as well. So
Yes.
we got this one here. Is Docker the only container runtime, and why is it used mostly compared to others?
Yeah, very good question. Docker is definitely not the only container runtime. Definitely not. So, why is Docker used more than others? That's a very good question. What Docker did was Docker simplified the use of containers. So the old technology that's behind containers has existed in Linux operating system and even Windows operating system in terms of the isolation, and in Linux talking about the C groups. Those technologies has existed for a long time. But what Docker did was to make it simple to use, so that you want to build a container image, you just simply do Docker build, and your container image is built. You want to pull a container image to run, you just simply do Docker build or Docker run. So it simplified how we work with containers, right? And if you know developers like something to be simple, right? It's sort of like, okay, so when they saw what Docker was doing, it's like, this is getting interesting. I think I can use this to build my applications, right? So Vijay is mentioning some other options. So we have Podman, we have we have tons of different options that exist in terms of container options. However, again, what Docker brought into the picture initially was the simplification of container concepts. Okay, so Sarkofi, let's check very quickly. So how do I build the image? Let's have a quick look at that. So I have my Docker virtual machine now. How do I go ahead and turn that into an image that I'm going to build? So to create a container image, we use something called a Docker file, right? So we use something called a Docker file. What is a Docker file? A Docker file is a simple text file that contains a step-by-step instruction on how to build a container image. So I have a text file. That text file is going to contain line-by-line instruction to say, here's how you're going to take my application, and here's how you're going to make a container image from this application. So once we have that file, then we run the Docker build command against the Docker file, and we're going to end up with a Docker image. So in other words, Sarkofi, we have our Docker file that has the instructions. We run Docker build against that Docker file, and we have a Docker image at the end of that.
Got it.
So what I'm going to do very quickly is I'm going to go over to a virtual machine that I already have prepared over here. And I have an application that I downloaded from Microsoft GitHub repo. So if I do a list, I have this application here called ACI app. So if I just do cd ACI app to go to that directory, if I do a list, you can see that I have a Docker file here. I do a cat for the Docker file. You can see an example of a simple Docker file. Right? It is a very, very simple Docker file. So my application exists in this directory called app. So what I'm doing is, first of all, I'm going to go grab something called a base image from Docker Hub, right? I'm going to go out to Docker Hub. I'm going to go grab that base image. Then I'm going to create a directory inside that image. Then I'm going to copy my application from the host. I'm going to copy it inside that image. Then I'm going to change the location to the location that I just copied my application into. Then I'm going to run npm install because that's a Node.js application. And then I'm going to specify, if somebody goes to run this image, I want you to run my application. So that's an example of a simple Docker file, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to run Docker build against this, and we're going to build our container image based on that. Now remember, This is an application that I just downloaded from Microsoft GitHub page. So that's where I've downloaded that from. So to go ahead and do this, if I do docker build, and I'm just going to use a dot. So if I just do that, what that signifies is that look in the current directory and look for any Docker file that you find. So that's what the dot means. So it's going to look for Docker file in the current directory, and I'm going to give it a tag. So a tag is like giving it like a label. Well, it's not like a label, but it's like just giving it like a version in Docker world, or giving it a name. So I'm going to give it a tag. I'm going to call it ACI application. So Sarkophia, I'm just going to go ahead and put ACI-application, and I'm going to run that. And you can see that it's going to go through this line from step line 1 all the way to the last line, and it's going to build a container image from that. And there you go, Sarkophia, I've got my container image now. So if I do Docker, let me clear the screen first of all. I do a Docker image list. So I know that this is a bit disjointed, so apologies for that, because I have multiple images that I've built previously on this Linux VM. So let's clear the screen. Let's run that again. So the image that I just built now is this one right here. You can see that it was created 26 seconds ago, right? And that's the ID. So there you go, Sarkophie. So now that makes sense to us, let's go ahead and talk about other things.
Okay, I got a question here. So let me just bring this up on the screen for Michael.
Yes, sir.
Say, why always Docker? And why not Docker and Windows?
Well, why not Docker and Windows, or Kubernetes and Windows? Oh, okay, but you can run Docker on Windows. So the thing that I just did right now, you can have that running on Windows, Michael. So there's nothing stopping you from, if you're doing a Windows container, right? If your application is Windows based and you're doing a Windows container, you can install something called Docker Desktop for Windows, and you can do the same thing, right?
Okay.
So, but again, to answer your question, why always Docker? Remember, right, what Docker brought to the table. It simplified the use the use of containers. That's what it brought to that, right? So, in terms of when we talk about container runtime, a lot of platforms like Kubernetes are moving away from Docker, right? They are moving to other options. However, when it comes to building images, I think Docker is still going to be around for a while. If a company has done a good job, you've got to respect that. so okay. So let's go very quickly to the next one. So now that's building container images. So Sarkophie, the next thing that we talked about is we have to store and distribute the images, right? We have an image that we built from a Docker virtual machine. Now we've got to store and distribute it somewhere. That is where Azure Container Registry comes in. Azure Container Registry is a service in Azure that we can use to store and distribute container images. David, is Azure Container Registry only for distributing container images? No. You can use it to store other containerization artifacts. If you're familiar with things like Helm charts, you can use Azure Container Registry to store your Helm charts. You can use it to store other things, right? So, however, the primary use case is to store and distribute container images. So let's go quickly have a look at that, because that's leading us towards the exam objectives that we're covering. So what I'm going to do now, Sarkophie, is I'm going to go over to my Azure environment very quickly, and I'm going to go create a container image, a container registry that I'm going to use to store the application that I just created, the Docker, the application that I just containerized. Now, remember the application that I just containerized, it's an application that I got from Microsoft and GitHub. So if I go to over here, so let's create container registry. I'm going to specify container registry there. David, do we have to use container registry? No, there are other options. There's a popular Docker Hub. It's like dockerhub.com. It's a public container registry platform that you can use to store and distribute images. Are you going to use Docker Hub public to distribute your enterprise applications? Probably not. If you're creating an open source application, that's fine. However, Docker Hub also has a private version, right? A private instance that you can use in a private way that allows us to store and distribute container images. But Azure also has their own equivalent. So actually, the same software that's running Docker Hub is the same software that's running on Container Registry. So they're both using open source Docker Registry. So
All right.
let's go over to here. So I'm going to go create a new resource group, Coffee. I'm going to call it Containerization. Let's go ahead and let's go to Containerization. I'm going to click OK to that. Registry name, I'm going to call this DOACR 01. That's still available. No, it's not available. Let me go get another name. Let me go get a better name that's going to be more unique. Let's call this by the name of the location. So UK South
Okay.
Azure Container Registry. So I'm going to call it UK South Azure Container Registry. Actually, you know what? Because I've been having issues with UK South these days. So let me rephrase that. Let me call it West Europe.
All right.
I had issues with UK South in recent days. I think Microsoft are throttling some stuff. So yeah, I think yeah. So anyway, I'm gonna use West Europe. I'm gonna leave that. I'm not gonna configure anything else because again, we're just going somewhere. So I'm just gonna move very quickly and I'm gonna go to create my container registry. So once I have my container registry Sarcopy, I'm going to be pushing my image into it, right? And I'm going to be storing my image into that. So in order to do that, one of the options that I can use is I can go to grab the username and password for this registry. This is not a good practice. This is not the best practice. The best practice is to use Azure AD with role-based access control and use an Azure AD service principal or a managed identity to do that. However, we're in a lab environment and this is not really part of like the objective. So I'm just going to use this. So I have the username, I have the login server. So I'm going to log into my registry very quickly. So let's go over here, clear the screen. I'm going to do a Docker login and I'm going to specify my registry. It's asking me for the username. So I'm going to go get the username here and I'm going to use that username. And it's asking me for the password and I'm going to grab one of the passwords and I'm going to use that password. And it says login succeeded. So we're in business Coffee, everything is looking good. So the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to push the image that I just created called ACI app. I'm going to push it into this registry. How do I do that, David? The way that we do that is, first of all, we have to tag our image. What's the use of that? What that means is that we have to tag our image with the registry that we want to push it into, first of all. So in this case, I want to push my image into this registry. So I'm going to tag it with the address of this registry. So I'm going to do a Docker tag. I'm going to specify the name of my image, which I called ACI app earlier, the latest version, which is the latest tag. And I'm going to tag it with the address of my registry. So I'm going to put that in there. I'm going to use /ACI app latest.
Okay, so you tag this one as latest. So just in case you have another a more recent one, and you're pushing it you're pushing it, will they overwrite this one?
That's a very good question. I can override that. That's a very good question, Zakofi. But however, in like if I'm doing this like in real world, I'll probably just have a version number rather than just using latest. So the latest version, if I specify latest, whenever I'm pulling images from the registry, is going to grab the latest version that was pushed into it. Right.
Okay.
So, but just for this case. So I've tagged it now. So then what I can then do is I can then push it. I can then do a Docker push. And I can then specify that, and that's going to push it into the registry. And hopefully that gets, and there we go. So that's going to push that into the registry. And at the end of that, we're going to have, if I go under repositories, and if we refresh that, there you go. So that's our repository there, and that is our image there, right? So, and we can see the different layers of the image. Okay, so that's very good. So let's get to the very interesting one, which is what leads us to our exam objectives. So the next thing that we're going to look at, Sir Kofi, is the runtime options. And I'm going to talk about this very, very quickly. I'm just going to introduce you to some of the stuff. So when we talk about options for running container images in Azure, we have two main categories here, Sakofi. We have the options, which are single instance options or options that don't support orchestration. And we have options that support orchestration. So let's wait a minute there, Sakofi. What do we mean when we say orchestration? That's a very good question, right?
Yes.
Because one of the things that we like to do in technology and IT is we like to use some of those big words, right? And Sakofi comes to me, or I go to Sakofi. I'm like, Sakofi, I'm trying to understand this thing about Kubernetes. Can you help me to understand? And then Sakofi won't do this, of course. Sakofi will be like, forget Kubernetes, just take the money. That's 1 year salary for you. If you're like Kubernetes experts, you won't earn this money. Take the money, leave me alone, David. That's what Sakofi would say, right? But let's say I go to another technical guy that's trying to make it like we all are, not to a big man like Sakofi. If I go to that other guy, I will probably go get some fancy words and say, David, Kubernetes is about orchestrating capabilities. And then by the time you finish, you're like, I'm confused. You've just given me like 15 new words that I don't understand. So let's try to understand what we mean when we say there are some container runtime options that support orchestration and some that don't support orchestration. What do we mean by the ones that support orchestration? What are we talking about? So let's take a little step back, Sakofi. If you remember, like in the days of VMware, right? You still remember Sakofi? You remember VMware?
Yep. That's
And VMware, you remember like what they call ESXi hosts, right? You have your ESXi hosts, which are the different hosts that VMware manages. In Hyper-V, you just have your Hyper-V machines and stuff. So Sakofi has its organization. If I go to Sakofi and I say, hey, we're going to be running your application that you're going to be using for mining crypto, we're going to be running that organization on a single ESXi server. Sakofi will probably say, no, David, that's not good. Because if that single ESXi server fails, all my applications has failed, right?
that's
So David, that's not good enough. I want you to make that highly available. I want enterprise capabilities here. So David goes back and David comes back with an idea. Sakofi, here's what we're going to do. We're going to have two ESXi hosts that's going to be running virtual machines, that's going to be running your applications. And then we're going to have another application sit on top of those virtual machines or those machines. And that application in VMware world is called VMware Vcenter, right? So VMware Vcenter is a solution that can manage multiple ESXi nodes. So that whenever I want to deploy a virtual machine, I go to VMware Vcenter and I say, I want to deploy this virtual machine. VMware Vcenter will make the decision and say, I'm going to deploy this virtual machine on this host. I'm going to deploy the other one on this host. If this host fails, I'm going to restart this virtual machine that was running over here. I'm going to restart it over here because that has failed, right? So it's going to do things like scheduling of my virtual machines. It's going to do the health monitoring of my virtual machines. I can use it to implement automatic patching of the machines, right? So those are the kind of things that VMware vCenter will provide. In Microsoft World, in Hyper-V World, that's called System Center Virtual Machine Manager. That's going to manage your Hyper-V nodes. That is exactly what we are talking about when we're talking about orchestration. In the same way, Sakofi, I can have multiple container runtime nodes, right? And multiple of them that can run containers. However, that is not good enough if I have multiple. I have to have something that can manage them, that can ensure that if my container is running on this, and if there were to be a failure, it's going to restart it over here, right? I can do things like affinity or anti-affinity. I can say, I don't want these two container images to run together on the same node because that will have an impact on my availability if that node fails. Or I can say, I want these two containers to run apart from each other, right? Maybe, or I want them to run together, maybe for performance reason. So what provides that is something called a container orchestrator.
okay. So, if this is so good, how come we have another one you don't need orchestration? In which scenario do you need orchestration?
Very, very, very good question, Sir Coffee. So, because if you look at it depends on the use case, right?
Right.
So, for example, all you just want to do is you just want to run a background task, right? That's all you want to do. So, in some cases, you just want to run a web application like Azure App Service that we talked about yesterday. Remember that
Yeah.
Azure App Service allows us to run our web application as containers, also, right?
Yeah.
So that service itself has some level of high availability built into the service, and I just
Sure.
have my web application that I want to run. In that case, I might not necessarily need full orchestration and stuff, right? But in
Right.
some cases where I'm designing my own application and I have all this multi-container solution, I'll probably be using an orchestration option to ensure that I can get those enterprise capabilities. So we're not going to go through everything because for the use case and for the objectives of this course or of the AZ104, we're only going to focus on two. So we can deploy a virtual machine, install a container runtime on it, and run our container images. We can use a service called container instances to run our container images. We can use a service called app service that we talked about yesterday to run web application container images or API application container images. We can use Azure Function to run microservices as containers. We can use Azure Batch for high performance compute scenarios to be able to, schedule a lot of tasks to run on multiple nodes. But then the nodes are going to be running containers. So those are options that we have without orchestration. The options with orchestration, we have Kubernetes service. Kubernetes is by far the most popular container orchestrator out there. We have Azure Service Fabric, and we have Azure Red Hat OpenShift. So these are managed services, which means that we don't have to go deploy Kubernetes from scratch by ourselves. We don't have to go deploy Red Hat OpenShift from scratch by ourselves. We don't have to go. So these are managed services that provide orchestration capabilities for us to use.
All right. So looks like there's a lot of services. So it's more like any flavor that you want, you can choose. But can you mix and match? So, for example, if I have a front end apps and also let's say mid tier and maybe the back end, can I mix and match these specific services?
Yeah, it's possible. It's possible to do that. So I've seen like different architecture where people have, like to your points, they have like maybe a background task that's running in the background. They have that hosted on Azure Container Instances, and maybe they have something else hosted on Azure App Service, right? And then that's like sort of like the web front end. Or maybe you're running, maybe your app service, the web application that you're running on app service is going to be making calls to certain APIs that you're running as microservices on Azure Function. So essentially it's like up to you to like really design the scenario for the solution that you want to design for.
All right.
Okay, so what we're going to focus on is we're going to focus on these two: container instances and Kubernetes service, because that's what the course objectives cover. So container instances, what is that? What is a container instance? So Sakofi, let's go back to this environment and let's go bring some quick information, and then I'm going to go to the demo straight up. So here's what Azure Container Instances is about. So Microsoft definition says Azure Container Instances offers the fastest and simplest way to run a container in Azure. Forget all those marketing definitions. What are we talking about here? What we are talking about here is we're talking about a managed Docker virtual machine, Sarkofi. So instead of me deploying a virtual machine, and then I download Docker and then run Docker and install it on that. And now I've got to manage the operating system going forward, and I've got to manage the container runtime engine updates going forward, right? Container runtime engine going forward. All I need to do is go to the Azure platform and say, give me a virtual machine that has container runtime installed. I don't want to manage operating system. I don't want to manage container runtime. I just want to run my image.
So
Which
you
is
mean
why,
get down to business. We don't
exactly.
need,
We don't need all of that stuff, right? Like we don't require, infrastructure, virtual machine provisioning, ongoing maintenance. Forget all of that stuff. I just want to run containers. That's all. So it has a faster startup time compared with virtual machines. So and I'll go to show you how that works in a minute. So the use case for this one is for isolated container workloads, right? So they don't require orchestration like we talked about, Sakofi. So
what
we
about
can
networking? Can you still network them?
Oh, yes. So, for example, if you have a look at the example that I have on the right hand side here, you can see that we have
Oh
a
yeah.
container image, and then you can see that we're exposing certain parts. We can make it, when we're deploying it, we can make it public or private. If we make it private, it's actually going to deploy this into a private virtual network in Azure, right? So you can see that this is essentially a managed Docker virtual machine, but I don't have to manage it. If I'm deploying it, I can say I want to make it public. If I make it public, it's going to give it a public IP address. If I make it private, it's going to give me the option to deploy it into a private virtual network.
Nice.
So, so the underlying host, like we mentioned, that's managed by Microsoft for us. We don't have to deal with that. That can be Windows or Linux. We don't have direct access to the underlying host, right? So, or to the Docker API, we don't have direct access to that because, again, it's a managed service. So, what I'm going to do, Sarkoff, is I'm going to quickly go create a container instance, and I'm going to take the application that I downloaded from Microsoft, and I'm going to go deploy that application on that. So, let's go very, very quickly back to our demo environment. So, let's go to the Azure portal. And this is only going to take a few minutes. You see how quick this is going to be, Sarkophis. So I'm going to go over here to create a resource. And when I'm creating the resource, I'm just going to type in container instance. We have container instances there. So I'm just going to go create that. I'm going to give it a name called, because I'm going to have it in West Europe. So I'm going to keep it very straightforward. So I'm going to give it a name called West Europe Web App ACI. So I'm going to put it into that same resource group that I created earlier. Give it this name. It's going to be West Europe. I'm going to go pull the image from Container Registry, the image that I just built just a few minutes ago. So I'm going to pull that from my Container Registry. And you can see that it's identified my
Yeah.
image, latest version. It also identified that the image is Linux
Linux.
based. So that's why it's automatically selected Linux.
Okay.
And all I just
So
need to do is, yeah, sorry,
so
Sakofi.
for the OS type,
Mm.
it's always going to be based on the image.
The image, exactly,
Yeah.
yeah. So if it's a Windows container, it's going to be Windows. If it's a Linux container, it's going to be Linux. Yeah. And then I specify the size. Now the networking part is what we're asking about. You can see that I can make it public, right? In which case it's going to say it's going to have a public IP address. It's going to ask me which ports do I want to expose to the internet. If I make it private, it's going to say, hey, which network do you want to put this in? So I can put it in a private network if I wanted to. So, but I'm going to make this one public because we want to access the application. Also, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give it a DNS name. So I'm going to call this West Europe Web App, my container. I'm going to go to next. I'm not going to modify anything, so I'm just going to go to create that. So you see how simple this is, Coffee, right? It's
Yes.
like,
Right.
I don't have to go deploy and downloading stuff and doing all that stuff. I'm just going to say, here's my image, run it. I don't want to know what you're doing with the management of the operating system and all that stuff going forward. That's your responsibility, Microsoft. So that's one option that we have. So while this one is deploying Sarkofi, let's quickly talk about a concept that we have in our exam objectives, because let's go to the exam objective that we're looking at earlier. So the exam objective called out that configuring container groups. What is this container groups? What is this about? Very, very quickly, let's talk about it. So container groups, because in some situations, Sarkofi, we don't just want to run a single container image on our container instance. We want to run multiple container images on the instance. So for example, in this case of this diagram, I have a web application that's running as, I have the container image running as a container, right? The web application. I've exposed that part. I have another container image that's running here, which is a database container image from MongoDB, right? I've actually connected that. I'm going to link that to an Azure file share so that anything that's going to be written to this database is actually going to be written, is going to be persisted to Azure file share in the backend, right? The database is not going to be public. It's going to have a public IP address. However, my users can interact with this web application front end, and then the web application can read and write data persistently from the database, which is also storing that in Azure storage. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah. So that is what container groups are about. It's
So
about,
with the container
yeah.
groups, can it also act like a load balancer? Can it be like a way to monitor the health and then um, pass certain traffic to specific containers?
So no. So
No.
remember that this doesn't. So what you're talking about there, that would be orchestration capabilities, right?
Okay.
It's not as if you now have like multiple instances. You actually have to design that in your application to say you need to go talk to this service. Your application has to know that it has to go talk to this service on port 27017. And actually, your application, if you were to be able to log into this application, um, essentially they're sharing the same network. So
Okay.
as far as they are concerned, they are running on the same OS, even though they are different containers. So for example, you can reach this container instance by just going to localhost and port 27017. So it's going to be able to reach this container instance on localhost because it's like we're together. It's like we're running on the same network. It's like we're the same system, right? So
Right.
while this one can also reach this one on port 80 localhost.
Okay. We got a question around the network
Yes.
as well. So, Visha say, in which scenario network type NAND getting used for container deployment? I think maybe you want to
Oh, okay,
clarification
that's
on
a
the
very, very
network.
good question.
Yeah.
So it's talking about let's go to so I guess the question there that was being asked was when I was creating this container instance, there was an option. So if I go to container instance and I'm just gonna give it a random name and just move very, very quickly because I'm looking at the time here. And but it's good, like I always like talking about the old chain because it helps people to understand that. So I'm just going to make that random. I'm just going to go to next networking and specifying none. So it says none will not create either a public IP or virtual network. You'll still be able to access container logs using the command line. So in other words, this is a situation where you just want to do maybe some tests, right? So it's not really a situation that where you're running anything that you're accessing. So that's the scenario that you're going to be using none. It's
Oh, okay.
you're
We
going to
got other
be.
questions, but these are related to the course. So
Oh,
we'll answer
okay.
those after the session.
Oh, okay. No problems at all. Okay. So let's go very, very quickly. So our application is now running. So if I go over to container instances, so let's go look at the application that we downloaded from Microsoft. So again, I just got that directly from Microsoft GitHub, downloaded that application, and I just pulled it from GitHub and just ran it. So it's just a simple Hello World application. So let's copy that. Let's go to HTTP and let's go to paste that. Whoa!
There you go.
OMG! Saka, you bought Microsoft already. You bought Microsoft. You didn't tell me. I was wondering what's going on over here.
Is
Ladies
this
and
real news
gentlemen,
or fake news?
welcome to Sarkoph's gold giveaway, man. There you go. We've got gold giveaway time. Wow. I didn't know you bought Microsoft also. I thought I was just pulling a basic image from Microsoft and there you go. Because Sarkozy giving
Yeah,
us.
that's a good one.
So we got that over there. So that's the so let's quickly talk about the other one. So when it comes to container groups, so just let me quickly drop this information. When it comes to container groups, unfortunately, we cannot create that using the portal at the moment. We have to deploy that using YAML. So I'll show you an example of what that looks like. So I've got an example of a YAML file. So let's go to over here. Let's go to Vim, and I've got a YAML file over here called deploy.aci.yaml. And so, for example, if I wanted to create a container group, I have to define it in YAML like this case. So I specify the location, the name of my container instance, the web application, sorry, the containers that I want to deploy. In this case, I can go specify my registry the image. So if I go to West Europe ACR, and I'm going to go grab that image from that. So essentially I have to, so now you said I'm defining more than one container. I'm defining two. So that's the first one over there. And this is the second one over here. So
Oh,
this allows me to be able to define it in YAML. This is the only way that we have at the moment to create container groups. So I specify my container images. I specify the port that I'm exporting. So you see that this is port 80 I'm exporting, this is port 27017. Essentially, the scenario that I showed you in the diagram, right? So, and also I'm mounting a file share called file share volume. And what I'm doing here is I'm specifying the credential to use to connect to my container image. So that credential is obviously not correct. So I'm going to go grab the right credential of my container registry so that it has the credential to go pick the image from the registry. So let's go grab that very, very quickly. Come on, come on, come on. So I'm just going to go grab that. And by the way, just going to skip through very, very quickly. Actually, you know what? I think that we may actually have one more one more session for containers because otherwise we're going to rush this. So you know what? I'm not going to rush it. I'm just going to take my time to show you container groups, and we'll stop there for today.
All right.
We'll schedule.
We got a few questions, so we can answer those ones afterwards after this.
Yes, sir.
This one.
Yes, sir. No problems. So here you go. So I'm defining my image. I'm also specifying that I'm going to export port 80, right, which tallies with the first container that I defined, right, and I'm going to expose it with that DNS name. And I'm also going to specify my file share that I'm going to use. So I'm going to specify a file share called Mongo share. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go very quickly to an Azure storage account that I have. I'm going to just use that storage account right there. I'm going to go to create a file share called, let's go to that. Let's go to under file shares. I'm going to create a file share called Mongo share because that's what will be looked for. So by the way, so hopefully that makes sense to you. So that's how you define container group. So if I go ahead and click create, so that's going to create that. If I go ahead and grab the access key for my storage account because I'm going to need that. So that's the name, that's the key. So I'm going to grab that key. So Mongo share, I'm going to replace that name with the name of my storage account, which is app data store 30. So app data store 30. And I'm going to
You're missing the E, the
Oh,
store.
I think I didn't put the E there.
Nobody. Okay.
Yeah, so I just added as data store. Yeah. So I'll just go ahead and get rid of the storage account key and put in my proper storage account key. And what that would do is it's going to create a container group. So remember this for your exam if you're planning to do the exam. So I'm just going to write that. And then I'm just going to go deploy that. So let me quickly go deploy that Sakofi and then I'll stop for today. And then we'll just take questions for the rest of the day. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to log into my Azure environment. So I'm going to do AZ login. I'm going to go to that, log in with that over there. And I'm going to put in the code that it gave to me right now. So which is this code over here. So again, keep it in mind if you're taking the exam. Container groups can only be created with YAML definition, not with you can't create them from the portal at the moment. Okay, so once I've already signed into my Azure environment, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to just do AZ container create. I'm going to specify my resource group, which I called container RG, and I'm going to specify the file that the YAML file, which is called aci.yaml. And if I go ahead and run that, so what that's going to do is that it's going to begin the process. The image West Europe ACL.HCL. Let me quickly go check the name of my container registry because I might have messed that up. So let's just check that. West Europe ACL. Yep. So that's the name of my container registry. And okay, let's sort that out very quickly. Let's see what's going wrong and let's fix that. So West Europe ACL.HCL.io ACI hub. Let's go to fix that. So let's go to that. So let's go to location. Okay, I'm just going to change that. That's the reason why it's complaining, because the location that I specify is UK South, and obviously I'm not in UK South, I'm in West Europe. So let's fix that. Uh, West Europe Web App ACI 2. I'm going to call that. I'm going to call this UK South Web App the image. Everything else looks okay to me, so I think that that should be okay now, ladies and gentlemen. So let's go to deploy that one more time, and I think that that should be okay. Should be able to grab the image using the credential. Okay, let me check my credential one last time. If I try this one more time and miss something, so West Europe, see how. Oh, I can see Sarkophy. Can you see what I've done? Yeah, I did. I didn't change the name of the registry server. I need to change the name of my registry server for that to work. So let's go fix that. West Europe ACHow.azure.io. So that's good. So let's save that one last time, and hopefully hot time is a charm. Come on, come on, come on, come on, come on, come on.
That look promising.
I'm not sure if it looks promising. Oh, here we go. Yeah, it's already pulling down the images, and then it's going to carry on and do that. So by the time we finish, we're going to have a container group. And if I go under container instances, I'm going to have a new container instance, and it's going to have two containers within the container group over there. So it's going to be called West Europe Web App ACI 2. So that's it for today, ladies and gentlemen. So next week, what I'm going to do is I'm going to slot in Azure Kubernetes Service to conclude this part, and then that's going to lead us. So let me quickly just show what the next, because we're running towards the end of this particular one now, Sarkophy.
Yeah, that's right.
We're almost towards the end of this.
Yeah, so yeah, there's a question around that one, that when are we going to finish this session?
Oh,
Because I think
question.
Ian is looking to take the exam, so you want to know when we're going to finish the session, before June, or I think it should be before June, right?
Before June end, yeah, definitely. So because this is where we currently are. So we're currently on, today is not, oh, today's first, yeah. So this is
Sure,
where
yeah.
we currently are. So what I'm gonna do next week is, so what we're gonna do, here's what we're gonna do, ladies and gentlemen. So next week, because we have a guest speaker, so we have a guest speaker that's an expert in this area. So that's gonna be speaking to us. So he's gonna be speaking to us on storage and data protection, and he's also going to speak to us on monitoring. So we'll carry on with that next week. And then what we'll do is that on the 14th, I'm gonna do the concluding part of Azure Kubernetes Service. And I think I also did not do the concluding part of networking. So I'm just gonna do the concluding part of networking and Azure Kubernetes Service on the 14th. We're gonna do an exam preparation session. So on the 15th is when we're gonna finish everything relating to the AZ104 exam objectives, and we'll be done. Sarkophy, you have something for us today in terms of the lab. So let's
So
share
in
with us
terms of
what
the
you have.
labs, yeah, since we are not done with the container,
Yeah.
I'm just going to publish that one mid of the week,
Oh,
right?
okay.
So
Yeah.
yeah, we should see that in mid of the week. Yeah.
Yeah. So which email should we contact for the gold
Yeah.
giveaway?
So what we're going to do is we're going to publish this one into the group, so meetup group. So I hope everyone is part of the meetup group. So if you look into watch out for the labs essentially in the meetup group.
Yeah. Thanks very much.
And
And
also you
also
can
just
check the YouTube as well, the YouTube channel,
yeah.
David's YouTube channel.
And for the meetup group, we also have like an arrangement with Microsoft. So if you're not part of the meetup group, unfortunately, Microsoft, well, fortunately for people that are in UK, but unfortunately for others. So Microsoft, essentially, they are engaging with us. And if you go to the meetup page or to the LinkedIn group, Microsoft essentially has three prices, which include like a
Yeah.
Surface, and there's an Azure Administrator challenge that you can take. So please do take advantage of that, right? So take advantage, but the prices we only go to if you're a UK resident. So that's how the people that can win the prizes. But anyway, it's still like a good challenge, even if you're not like
Exactly.
a resident in
It
the
is.
UK.
Yeah. All right. Let's just quickly answer some of the few questions that we have here, because I was just waiting for the session to end.
Yes.
So let me bring this up real quick. So Michael have a question. I'll say, can you please do a Windows version of the demonstration. I mean, build a Docker or app container. Is it something you can do next week?
So I can probably slot that in the so next week because we have a guest speaker, so we won't
Oh yeah,
be
yeah,
moving that. However, the upper week when I do the conclusion for AKS and virtual networking, I can slot in some stuff over there. But essentially, it works similar to like what we've done.
so
But that's not a problem. We can definitely go through that.
all right.
So yeah.
Let me bring up next question. So Adijo said, if something happens to a container instance, does it keep its state, or how do we ensure that we have on it? It doesn't lose. Yeah, it doesn't lose its
Very good
session.
question. So from this diagram that I showed earlier, so it does not keep its state by default, right? So, so if you want the states to be persistent across things like restart or reboot, you have to write the data to an external store. So again, remember that this is a managed platform. You're not guaranteed as if this is a host that you're going to always get. So just be aware of that. So what you're going to do is what I did with my YAML file, which is I defined um, a file share on Azure Storage. And then in my YAML file, I mounted that to my container instance. And then my application will be writing to the location that I've mounted to. So that's how you do persistent storage. Otherwise, anything that you're writing locally here will go away if it's, that stopped and that restarted. Because again, the hosts are just ephemeral. Okay.
Okay.
Any other question?
Yeah, can you help Michael with this? So he's not a Windows person, so he just wants to know how to proceed.
Oh, okay. The aspect of the of the AZ 10 of the 104 exam.
Any advice?
So here's the thing, Michael, is that I want to just help you with this one. Don't be afraid of Linux as if that one, right? Anytime you get to interact with a new technology and stuff, it looks as if it's going to be overwhelming to you. You're like, no, I don't deal with commands, right? That's not my thing. I don't deal with that. No problems. Take the labs that Sarkov is publishing. Just do the labs. Whether you understand it, whether it makes sense to you or not, just do the labs, right? And before you know it, it's going to help your comfort with that technology. So I understand what you mean, right? It can be tough, like if you're familiar with like Windows and then you're moving over to Linux and stuff like that. But to be honest, a lot of things that you already know applies in this scenario.
Yeah.
And also when it comes to the exam, you're not going to be getting like every Linux questions like, what is the command that you're going to be using this? A lot of the questions are going to be based on concepts. So once you understand the concept of the services, you'll be okay for the exam.
Okay, we got one here. Adijo again said, to mount a file share, it needs a root access on the container, which I think it is just too permissive.
Very good question. Very good question, Adiojo. So I won't go into details on that, but what I will recommend to you is if you go to my YouTube channel, I actually had a session that I did at an event some time ago, and the session was on how attackers compromise containers in Azure. And one of the demonstrations that I did there was specifically on Azure Container Instance. So, but that's sort of like the thing, right? So, yeah, it does use root access, and if the application was to be compromised, the person that's compromised the application essentially gains root access on the host itself, right? In terms of that. So there are other things that you can do. So if you have a look at this session again, where I did how attackers exploit containerized Azure workloads, part 2. So I did a demonstration on Azure Container Instance. There are things that you can use to secure your Azure Container Instance. So, for example, Palo Alto has a solution called Prisma Cloud that you can use to do runtime protection for Azure Container Instance, which I think I demonstrated in that particular session. So, yeah, so that's the reality, but there are also ways to secure it. So, but that's sort of like the way that works. You can
All
sort
right.
of like say the same thing. There's always a risk if you're using Azure Kubernetes Service or just Kubernetes in general. There are certain credentials that gives like essentially like a lot of permission that exists on different nodes. If someone were to compromise one of your nodes and they get a hold of those credentials, that's essentially unlimited access to the nodes. So there are ways to mitigate those, but that's sort of like how that works. Sorry.
Okay, I did you have a follow-up question as well? It said that from yesterday's series, at what scenarios could you use Azure functions to web apps? They seem to have the same interface.
Um, so they have the same interface, but they're different services. So Azure Function is an extension of Azure Web App. So what happens is that if you look at the history behind that, Microsoft has Azure App Service, and there is a capability called Azure Web Jobs, which allows you to run background tasks on Azure App Service. So that was really popular, and that was where Azure Functions evolved from, which is why they have similar functionalities, similar capabilities, and stuff. However, Azure App Service is more designed, or a better use case for that would be more monolithic applications, right? You have a web application that's monolithic, you're running on premises. You can do a lift and replatform to Azure App Service. Azure Function, especially the serverless consumption plan, is more tailored towards microservices, right? So, for example, there's a default timeout of 5 minutes that you get with Azure Functions and that you don't get with like Azure App Service. So, it's different use cases. And if I go to bring up okay, I don't have that document already open, but Microsoft has a nice document where they sort of do like a comparison of different container services in Azure and the different use cases. So, but the main thing to know here is that, yep, they have the same similar capabilities because Azure Function is an evolved from Azure Web App. However, it's more targeted towards microservices use case versus monolithic web applications.
Okay, that's interesting. All right, so we got one here from Gabriel. It's all about the challenge.
uh,
So, what about the non-UK residents? Is there any?
Microsoft replied to me. So Microsoft replied to me that that's only for UK residents. Fortunately or unfortunately. So,
So,
but for that, yeah. So it's for UK residents. So, yeah. I won't say if you have like a UK address or something, but it's not for me to say. But however, Microsoft says so I did speak to Microsoft representatives and they clarified and said that's for UK residents. So the reason is because the budget that's been allocated to be used for that is part of like the UK marketing team budget. So that's the reason why. So apologies for that, but you still get the benefit of if you top the challenge, you can go see. Could have won this if not for this restriction that Microsoft has.
okay, so the last question, I think this is a follow-up from Adijo's question from earlier. He said that what I did was instead of mounting it from the container itself in your code, you can call the file share in the code.
Mm. Yeah. Oh, I see what you're talking about. Yeah, you're mounting the file share in the code itself. See, the risk is always still there. So I get the point that you're making, Adiojo, but the risk is always still there. So here's the risk of the scenario that you described now. So the risk of the scenario that you described now is probably what you're going to do. So because there's always like a risk, right, in terms of that. You have your container instance, and then you have your container, and then you have your container instance that's running on this. So now you're defining your storage within your code itself, but now you have to specify the information of how to connect to the storage, and you have to specify that. So most likely you specify that using environment variables, or most likely you specify that in key vault, right? You specify that in key vault and stuff. But then now you need to give permission to that credentials to connect to your storage that you specified. You need to, maybe you use like managed identity. Maybe you're just using that as environment variables. Whichever option that you use, if your code were to have like a remote code execution vulnerability and someone was to be able to land on this, right, which is essentially what I showed. If you go have a look at the demo that I showed, you see that I was able to land on this instance, obtain the identity token that was associated, that was used to access other Azure services, right? And then used it to make a call to other Azure services. And I actually was able to download and install tool on this one to be able to make calls to other Azure services. So whichever way that you put it, whether you're mounting the storage directly or whether you're specifying it from code, if this ever gets compromised, you're in trouble either way, right? So, the only way to be able to guard against that in an environment like Azure Container, like this one, is to use runtime protection, use some form of runtime protection. So, and there are different tools and services that exist that allows you to be able to embed, there are RASP type protection that allows you to be able to embed process, network, and file system runtime protection for serverless container services like Azure Container Instance, or in the case of AWS Fargate. Sakofi, we've gone way over time. So normally we
Yeah,
don't want to go over time, but there's a lot of
yeah,
questions. So
yeah. There's a lot of engagement today. So thank you all for such a wonderful questions that you've been asking us. So I think for the rest, what probably we'll do is that we can actually answer them. Just to end here. What do you think?
yeah,
Or do you want me to keep
yeah,
bringing
I
you
think
up?
I'll answer Satish.
Oh,
So
that's Satish.
Satish,
All
so
right, let me bring up Satish
the
first.
content for this one. So I will cover this when I talk about AKS. So the
Yeah.
main thing is we're going to talk about so scaling AKS and network connections for AKS, which is talking about the private cluster and the different firewall components that you can implement, service endpoint, private endpoint, and then upgrading the cluster, scaling the cluster, and configuring storage for the cluster. So these are the four main topics that we're going to cover when I talk about that.
All right. All right. Thank you, guys. It's been a very wonderful session. I mean, you can tell from the engagement, everyone have a question for said the honorable said David. So we are very, very glad to have you, said David,
I
for
think I
running us
think people
through
are
the thing.
going to the wrong stuff again. Forget about Kubernetes. That's a long way to make your money. Be like Sarkozy. Be like Sarkozy. Make your money easy.
Yeah.
Quick.
So yeah, if you want to make the money through the God, men's God is there. Just joking. That's a quick way to lose your money.
Come on.
All right. All right. Thank you, guys. And we will see you in the next session. So make sure you join us next week. So, because next week we do have a guest speaker. So it's going to be a very interesting one as well. So
Yeah.
thank you.
Thanks very much. See you next
All
week.
right.
Bye.
See you next week, guys. All right. Bye.